My name is Alan Aboud, and I am a creative director, whatever that means nowadays. I've had my own agency since 1989 in London. When did I want to pursue this career? I don't know exactly when it started. Probably when I was in school. I wanted to be an architect. Was very interested in art and design, what is now design technology. Applied for architecture school, but didn't get in. But I had a very, very good art teacher who persuaded me to put a portfolio together and talked about this thing called art school. And there was one in Dublin called the National College of Art and Design, NCAD. And when I knew I was never going to get into architecture, I just put in a portfolio for foundation and was lucky enough to get in. As I was the youngest of four kids, my parents had kind of given up on wanting all of their children to go and do law or medicine, etc. So they were very willing to let me try what I got into. In 1984, I was in foundation. I did a year of foundation in Dublin and then moved into what they call a degree course in visual communications. And at the time, in 1985, Dublin was extremely depressed, not much chance of any creative work. And the inevitability was you would go to either London or go to America to get work. So there was a girl a couple of years ahead of me in NCAD who I got on really well with, and one day in the course of a conversation she was going, yeah, I'm going off to London, I've applied to this art school and I'm jumping ship, why don't you do it? I didn't know anyone in London, I didn't have any connections or whatever, so again blindly I applied to St. Martin's and amazingly got in. So that was after doing a year and a bit. So in 1986 I found out that I was going to St. Martin's, so I did 6 months in America on what they call a J1 visa, which was most Irish people's summer job, and then came back in September and started at St. Martin's. And I remember arriving in London not knowing anybody and heading into what was the halls of residence in Battersea, which was a big culture shock. And then the journey started. The most kind of significant thing about St. Martin's is the people that it attracts as opposed to the facilities. When I was at St. Martin's, probably the university or the art school with most facilities was Middlesex, but the people coming out of Middlesex were just dull people. So there was a great kind of cross-section of people in St. Martin's. You could hang out with the fine art people, you could hang out with the film people. So it was the people and the experiences and the hustle. You know, being in Soho essentially for 3 years of your life was pretty incredible. Not that any art student will have that kind of experience nowadays. So yeah, I just learnt how to work with people collaboratively, and how to hustle really. And that still goes on that way. It's all still a hustle, this industry. So in the course of my time at St. Martin's, I had the good fortune to do a lot of really nice work placements. In Dublin, I used to kind of pop back and work with who is now a very good friend of mine, a guy called Steve Averill. Steve Averill was the man who was the first manager of U2 informally, and was the man who gave them their name and the man who gave them their identity. And ostensibly, that was the guy who encouraged me to become a designer by looking at his album sleeves, particularly for that first one in 1980, which was Boy. So I worked with him, and then when I got into St. Martin's, I had one summer working at MTV London, which was being born in Camden. So I was working as an assistant there. And that was pretty incredible because it was, the prime of MTV, and was able to go to all these shoots. And I became quite friendly with a photographer called Spencer Rowell, who had just turned into doing music videos. Spencer Rowell is famous for the man cradling the baby in the Athena posters. So I managed to work with him on quite a few music videos. And then I also was lucky enough to work with another hero of mine, Malcolm Garrett, who had an agency called Assorted Images down in a godforsaken place called Curtain Road, which is not the Curtain Road that anyone recognises nowadays. And working with Malcolm used to design covers for Magazine, he used to design covers for Barry Adamson, he used to design covers for Devo, Buzzcocks, Duran Duran. So he was, the preeminent designer for sleeves at the time. So I worked with him. And through working with him, I worked with Jamie Reed on one of Jamie Reed's books, who was a friend of Malcolm's, and also Stephen Appleby, who was a really famous illustrator at the time. So I managed to build up a really good connection of people through just meeting people. And I think that's probably my biggest asset, not being a great designer or a great art director or a great creative director or a great typographer. It's actually been able to connect to people and get what you can out of people, and then bring in the right people to work with those people. Throughout that time in Soho, was kind of building up connections and forming relationships with other cohorts in the year, and I had a great kind of fortune to be working with some really nice people. I had an amazing tutor at St. Martin's who was an Irish man called Dermot Goulding, and he was probably one of the biggest influences on my career aesthetically. And he ran the photography department at St. Martin's, and had run the photography department at St. Martin's in Charing Cross Road. Worked with all the guys from the Sex Pistols, worked with Sade, worked with Gilbert and George. Previously to that, he was down in Brighton. So he had a worldliness about him, and he was kind of just giving me books about these amazing photographers around the world who I would never have experienced, like Joseph Kudelka or other contemporaries of his, which was one of his students was a guy called Steve Pike, who's an amazing portrait photographer. So Dermot was a big influence, and I spent a lot of time in the photography department as opposed to just doing graphic design. My course was graphic design, but I did a lot of creative photography. And probably latently, that's why I kind of got into creative direction and art direction, etc. So my degree show in '89 was primarily typography with found imagery. And I had been courting a design company over here called Why Not Associates, who were also tutoring me at the time, particularly a friend of mine called Andy Altman. And he came up to my show and said, "Oh wow, you really fucked it this time." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we were going to take you on as a designer, but like you haven't produced any design. It's just like bits of type and a couple of images." So that was a bit kind of disheartening. But in retrospect, one of the representatives of Paul Smith was at our degree show, and she was looking for a designer to work on some design projects for Paul. And this was pre-digital, pre-mobile, pre-everything. So she took a business card and called me several days later to try and come for an interview and talk about it. Unbeknownst to this person at Paul Smith, she had shortlisted about 4 or 5 people to come and interview basically for this role, and those 4 or 5 people all actually lived in the same house, and we all lived in a place down in Balham at the time. So every now and again, every couple of days, she'd ring up the number not realising it was the same number, and someone else would pick up and it would be the same thing. So we all managed to get called for interviews in the house. And at one stage there was another friend of ours who was a guy called Peregrine, but he was so posh he called himself Dave when we were at St. Martin's. Peregrine blagged it one day that he answered the phone and managed to get an interview even though he wasn't being shortlisted. But in retrospect, Peregrine is probably the most successful of all of us now, who runs a big design agency called Big Fish. But anyway, luckily I was asked to do some work with Paul Smith back in 1989. So I started 2 days a week working with them, and I was able to work above one of the shops, which was the nice shop, the concrete shop on Floral Street, number 44. And the other couple of days a week I was working with another art director called Stephen Coates, who was the art director of Blueprint magazine and I magazine. So I had a nice mixture between fashion and pure design. It was a hustle back in those days. It still is a hustle, but basically I had another friend of mine who used to be one of our tutors at St. Martin's, a guy called John Ingledew, and he had a studio in Archer Street in Soho, bang in the middle of what was the red light district. And he said he had desk space available. So at the time, I thought that might be quite a nice thing to do. And I was working at the time with another one of my friends from St. Martin's, a guy called Sandro. So we both took on a desk space in Soho. And ostensibly all we ever did was go there at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day to check the answer phone messages that didn't exist on the phone line that we got specifically put in at this studio. And that's how we started what we called a studio back in those days. So as the work with Paul Smith started to kind of grow, I managed to persuade Paul to allow me just to kind of do more of the work remotely. So I kind of decamped to Archer Street and slowly but surely brought on an assistant because there was more work to be done, and then it kind of grew from there, and the fact that I wanted to try and do more bits and pieces outside of just Paul Smith. I could have just done Paul Smith morning till night, but I feel and still feel it's really important to actually have a variety of design projects that can help inform and educate your other clients in the business in terms of how the work could be done or how best practice other companies operate. I've never really had a strategy. I've never really had a business plan. All of the kind of clients that I've ever picked up have been word of mouth, which has been lucky. But I think in retrospect, I think there's a huge, huge gap in terms of design education that has always been there. And as long as that gap is there, I don't think design is ever going to be as successful as it can be in the UK. We were never taught business sense. We were never taught budgeting. We were never taught any of that kind of stuff. And I just think it's a really integral part of the design process, because I think every designer can count on two hands how many times they've been burnt by clients by being unpaid, not being paid advances, under budgeting, etc. And I think there really should be some sort of design business management degree that could be bolted on, like in the way, like in St. Martin's, you have a fashion journalism course. So you're not coming up with designs for fashion, but you're being educated to work in fashion. The pros can be the cons and the cons can be the pros, depending on the time of the month it is. The pros are obviously, notionally, you are your own boss, but I think effectively you never are your own boss. You are always at the behest of a client. The cons are obviously you have to pay the wages, the salaries, the rent, come what may, at the end of every month. whether you've had a good month or a bad month. Whereas if you are employed as a designer for a company, you know what salary you're going to be getting every month, and you work to that budget. So it fluctuates. From 89 until 2015, I was pretty much working solidly with Paul Smith. From when I started, there was two lines. There was Paul Smith Mainline and Paul Smith, what they call Paul Smith Sportswear. And I think at the end of my kind of main tenure with Paul, we had about 11 lines or 10 lines, whether they be licensed or diffusions. So it was a huge operation, and at one stage there was probably about 15 people in the studio, which was obviously a huge pressure, because that's a big bill at the end of every month. 2015, things changed at Paul Smith. Paul was very interested in trying to work out a succession plan. And with everything like that, when new people kind of take new roles, we were kind of sidelined, and we kind of phased ourselves out of Paul Smith 2015 and just retained one brand, which was the Japanese collection. So that was a big kind of wake-up call in terms of a decrease in income, etc. So we took stock of everything, and we kind of really shrunk the business massively, from 15 down to about 4 or 3. Got a much smaller space and just kind of regrouped, and at the time thought it was never going to happen in terms of having life after that type of scale of business. But fortuitously, that was obviously 5 years before COVID. So we were probably 5 years ahead of the game in terms of what happened during COVID for a lot of my contemporaries in the business. I don't think it made too much creative difference, other than there was a weight off your shoulders financially. But I think, unfortunately, the scale of projects financially have reduced post-COVID. So I don't know how any business can operate that are at the level that we were in 2015. So, having 2 to 3 people in a design studio, I think, is probably the norm now. I don't know. I've never been one to be in the design studio gang. Like, I've my kind of, the people that I know were the Why Nots. They're gone. GTF, they're still going. They're doing very well, but totally different world, because they managed to kind of tack onto the art world. Tom Hingston, another colleague of mine, he's still working away in a studio. Mark Farrow has reduced down his staff as well. So I think we're all in the same boat, where we're operating on a much smaller scale, because that's the way the business has gone, ostensibly. And I think nowadays, you're tasked with ever declining budgets, clients who do a lot of stuff in-house. And now with AI, who knows where the business is going to go? The potential of AI is just immense. So I don't, my role could easily be, superfluous to a lot of brands. But I think the ones that I am working with are lucky enough to know that you still need a human to kind of create the right inputs, to create the right direction, whether that be a direction for a photographer or videographer or Midjourney or ChatGPT. If you can't be clever enough to suggest the correct prompt to a human or to a computer, you don't get the right results. You don't get the right generated image from AI. You don't get the right image from a photographer. So it's just adapting, basically. We don't use AI actively. One of our clients is adamant that we can't and shouldn't use AI. They're an American business, and obviously America is very litigious. and they're really worried about being sued. So we can't and don't use it for that very reason. And I think that's one of the main reasons why you don't get mainstream brands using it as actively. However, last week I think H&M announced that they're going to start using AI models for a lot of their campaigns. So it is creeping in, and it is an inevitability in the way that, when we were at St. Martin's, Mac was coming in, and we were banned from using Macs in our second year because the tutors were scared of what it was going to do to us creatively. So you kind of look back now and you kind of go, okay, well, we survived that one. And I think that AI is probably the next Mac revolution in a way, in terms of helping you do things that you couldn't do yourself, basically. Like when Macs came out, it made, type foundries and type technicians redundant, but that was just the way things rolled, and it empowered you to do it yourself and learn to do it yourself and do it well. And probably AI will help you create different things that you never knew you could create or never knew was possible before. What's next is just work until you die, unfortunately. There isn't an end to a career in this business, because unless you're very, very fortunate, it just doesn't give you that end reward financially. I remember I attended a talk when I was at St. Martin's with a very famous graphic designer called Abram Gaines. And Abram Gaines was this incredible graphic artist. And the talk back then, in 1987, 1988, was he was 90 when he was giving us a talk, or late 80s or whatever. And he basically was saying he was working every day and probably would work until he died, and he did, because even though he had the fame and he had the success and he had the ability to kind of keep kind of coming out with these incredible posters and designs, there isn't a kind of end game in design. And I think no one ever teaches you that at art school. And that's why it goes back to my argument about design business and design business management. There must be somewhere someone thinking about how do you get a young creative with a young business person and get them to grow something that has longevity, that future-proofs their lifestyle, basically. And I think that's the biggest problem in this industry, is just not having the two worlds working together from the age of 20. It was a vulgar thing back when you're 20 to talk about how do you do budgets, or how do you manage your project, etc. It was like, oh, just do it, it's fine. And I just think if people had done that then it would have been a much better end game. If you're asking me to give advice to any young creatives, I would say try and partner up with friends or colleagues who have some sort of business acumen and who are kind of interested in the design world. A good example is a friend of mine. His son has approached me to help with a new business he's starting, and he wants to create a new tailoring line based in California that will be targeted at young 20-year-old guys and girls, to get them into tailoring, to get them to be buying suits or jackets or trousers that are not just t-shirts or jeans. And he's partnering with his girlfriend's brother, who works at McKinsey, who does business plans and who, works out, 5-year plans, etc. And he's a geek, he's in business, he's in finance, all of the things that you're kind of encouraged not to kind of deal with traditionally when you're in art school. But I think, it's the only way that this guy's going to get his business off the ground, by having a solid business foundation. I think every bit of design has to have solid business sense, and I just think that's the biggest shortcoming in this industry.